wind cut across the empty plains of Oklahoma like a blade that never dulled, whispering through the broken stalks of corn that still clung to the red earth. Dust hung in the air, coating everything in the dull brown of struggle. It was a hard land, a cruel land, where the sun burned too hot and the rain came too little. But for the people who lived there, it was all they had. Among those faces, hardened by hunger and toil, was a boy named Charles Arthur Floyd. Born in 1904, he came into a world that didn't give much and took plenty. His parents were poor farmers, the kind that rose before dawn and worked until their bodies ached, all for the hope of another day's survival. There was no luxury, no comfort, just the endless rhythm of labor and the quiet resignation of people who had learned that life owed them nothing. Charles was different, though. Even as a child, there was a defiance in him. He didn't accept that this was all there was to life. The cracked hands, the empty plates, the debts that hung over their heads like storm clouds. His eyes burned with a kind of wild curiosity and a sense of injustice. He saw how the banks took farms from good men who'd spent their lives working the land, how the law looked the other way while poverty spread like a sickness. His father was a decent man, too proud to beg, too tired to fight, and his mother did what she could to keep the family fed. But the boy, he dreamed of something bigger, something that didn't involve bowing his head. On Sundays, he'd sit by the dirt road and watch the cars pass, rare, shiny things with men in suits driving them, smoke curling from their mouths as they laughed. They looked untouchable, like kings on wheels. Charles wanted to be one of them. He wanted the world to see him, to know his name, to never look down on him the way they looked down on his family. But dreams like that had a way of festering in a place where there was no path out. In time, the soil that raised him hardened his heart, and the dust he breathed became the grit in his soul. As a teenager, Charles did what most young men in Oklahoma did. He worked. In the fields, in the oil rigs, wherever there was a day's wage to be earned. But no matter how long he worked, the money slipped through his fingers like water. The world was stacked against him. The Great War had ended, but the promises of prosperity never reached places like his. The cities grew richer while the small towns fell into silence, forgotten by the country they'd bled for. And when the banks started foreclosing on farms, when neighbors packed up their lives on wagons and left behind everything they'd ever known, something inside him snapped. He was barely out of his teens when he met the wrong kind of people, the kind who didn't ask questions, who didn't talk about right or wrong, only about what needed to be done. A friend introduced him to a man from Missouri, a slick talker with a car and a plan. It started small, as it always does. A payroll truck, a handful of cash, and the promise of easy money. Charles had never known what easy money felt like. But when he held that first stack of bills in his hand, when he realized that he could take what the world had always denied him, something dangerous bloomed inside him. The heist went wrong, of course. They always do the first time. The law caught up quickly, and Floyd, barely 20, was sentenced to prison. It was there, behind the cold walls of steel and concrete, that he learned what kind of man he was going to become. Prison wasn't a place for redemption. It was a machine that turned desperate men into devils. He learned how to fight, how to lie, how to see the world not as it should be, but as it truly was. He saw how the guards treated the poor, how justice was just another word for power. The lesson sank deep. The system wasn't broken. It was built this way. When he finally walked out of that cell, the Oklahoma boy who'd gone in was gone. In his place stood a man with a new name and a new purpose. He didn't want pity. He wanted payback. He wanted to take from the same people who'd taken from his family and from every other poor soul struggling to survive. That's when the legend began to form. Not overnight, not in one bold act, but in the slow, deliberate steps of a man who knew he would never go back to scraping for pennies. They called him Pretty Boy Floyd, though no one quite remembers who gave him the name first. Some said it was because of his looks, the dark hair slicked back, the easy smile, the sharp suits that set him apart from the average crook. Others said it was because he moved with a certain grace, a kind of charm that disarmed even those who should have known better. Whatever the reason, the name stuck, and it fit him like a well-tailored jacket. He wasn't like the other outlaws of his time. He didn't rob for chaos or for the thrill of it. He had a purpose, or at least he told himself he did. When the Great Depression hit and families began losing their homes, Floyd became something of a folk hero, Rumors spread that when he robbed banks, he burned mortgage papers, wiping away people's debts, erasing their chains with fire and fury. Whether the stories were true didn't matter. The people believed in them, and that belief made him larger than life. Before all that fame, though, before the headlines and the manhunts, he was still just Charles, a man trying to find his place in a country that had turned its back on him. There were nights he sat alone in cheap motels, staring out the window at the endless highways, wondering how it had all come to this. Somewhere in the darkness, the boy who had once dreamed of freedom still whispered inside him, but the world had no patience for boys anymore. It demanded men who could take what they wanted or be crushed by those who could. In the small towns scattered across the Midwest, whispers of pretty boy Floyd began to travel faster than the law. Bankers trembled. Farmers smiled. Women swore they'd seen him in the shadows of train stations or riding down back roads in stolen Fords. Every time the law thought they had him cornered, he vanished like smoke. He moved fast, stayed quiet, and never lingered in one place long enough for the air to settle. That restless spirit came from those same dusty fields that had raised him, a man shaped by the land's unforgiving nature, too stubborn to die and too proud to kneel, even then. Before his name became synonymous with rebellion, Floyd had a kind of strange morality. He never robbed the poor, never took from the working man. He had a code, one that drew a line between the powerful and the powerless. To him, banks weren't victims, they were predators. The law wasn't justice, it was protection for the rich. And he, in his own twisted way, saw himself as the balance. There's a story told in Oklahoma about a night Floyd returned to his hometown. The sheriff caught wind and came looking for him, but when he found him, the two men just stood there in the street, staring at each other. Floyd smiled, tipped his hat, and said, "You know I won't shoot you, Sheriff. You were fair to my folks." The sheriff nodded, turned, and walked away. It's the kind of tale that might not be true, but in Floyd's world, truth and legend were the same thing. What mattered was how it made people feel. As America sank deeper into despair, the line between hero and criminal blurred. The newspapers painted him as a dangerous outlaw, a menace to society. But for every headline calling for his capture, there were a dozen families praying he'd never be caught. Children whispered his name like a bedtime story, and men at the bars raised their glasses to him, saying, "He's one of us." Still, the law doesn't care about legends. And for every soul Floyd inspired, there were men in suits back in Washington who wanted him buried. They saw him as a challenge to order, a symbol of defiance in a time when the government needed control. He was a crack in the image of authority, a reminder that even the most desperate could fight back. But before the FBI, before the manhunts and shootouts, before the myth took hold, there was just that boy in the fields, barefoot, sunburned, staring down a future that had no mercy. The road that would make him famous was already stretching before him, long and dusty, paved with the broken dreams of everyone he ever knew. He didn't know it then, but every step he took away from home was a step toward the legend he would become, and the doom that would follow. In those early years, before his name became a curse and a ballad, Floyd was just a man trying to survive in a world that had forgotten how to care. Maybe that's why his story still lingers, why people still whisper it like a prayer. Because at his core, Pretty Boy Floyd wasn't born evil. He was born desperate, and desperation in the right man can look a lot like courage. As the sun set over the Oklahoma horizon, painting the sky in colors of rust and blood, a young Charles Arthur Floyd stood on the edge of his family's field, fists clenched, eyes fixed on the distant road. Somewhere out there, he believed, was the life he deserved. He didn't know what it would cost him yet, but he was ready to pay it. And as the first stars appeared above the quiet farmland, the outlaw who would one day defy America took his first step into the shadows. The year was 1929, and America was unraveling. The stock market had collapsed, factories were closing, and the dream that once fueled the country was slipping away like smoke through broken glass. Men in suits jumped from office windows, while others lined up for bread they couldn't afford. Across the rural Midwest, families packed up their lives, leaving behind empty homes, barns collapsing under the weight of silence. The land itself seemed to give up. But in the midst of it all, one man found his purpose in the chaos. His name was Charles Arthur Floyd, But to the people, and soon to the law, he would be known as Pretty Boy Floyd. He'd been out of prison for a few years, moving from job to job, trying to keep his head down. But the truth was, the world didn't want him anymore. Ex-cons weren't given second chances. Every door he knocked on closed before he could even speak. His prison record followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. So when opportunity came knocking again, this time with the sound of engines and gunmetal, he didn't hesitate. The world had branded him an outlaw once. Now he decided to live up to it. His first real crew wasn't much to look at. A handful of small-time crooks, desperate men with nowhere else to go. But what they lacked in sophistication, they made up for in nerve. Floyd wasn't just another trigger-happy bandit. He had something different about him. He planned things, thought ahead. He carried himself like someone who knew exactly where he was going. And when the gang robbed their first bank together, it wasn't the money that made the biggest impact. It was how he handled it. Calm, confident, polite even. He spoke to the tellers with the smooth assurance of a man who had control of every second in the room. "Take it easy," he'd say, voice steady. "We're just taking what they took from us." When the job was done, he didn't shoot anyone, didn't cause unnecessary chaos. He was gone before the smoke cleared, and by the time the sheriff arrived, all that remained was the sound of tires fading into the distance and a few dazed clerks wondering if they'd just met a gentleman thief. That's when the newspapers first started calling him Pretty Boy. They said he smiled during the robberies, that he looked like a movie star instead of a killer. The name spread faster than any warrant could. Within months, Pretty Boy Floyd became a ghost story in small towns across the Midwest. The banks feared him, the people adored him. When he robbed a place, he was careful to burn mortgage records, tearing up the evidence of debts that hung over struggling farmers like nooses. Some say he did it out of kindness, others say it was strategy. After all, those same farmers would never betray a man who had freed them from their chains. Whatever his reasons, it made him a legend. In an age when the poor were crushed by the weight of greed, Floyd became a symbol of resistance. A man who struck back. He bought a fast car, because in those days, speed meant survival. He favored Ford V8s, the kind that could outrun the law on a straight stretch of highway. With his Thompson submachine gun on the seat beside him and the wind whipping through his hair, he looked less like a criminal and more like a man born for the open road. His reputation spread, and with it came opportunity. The country was teeming with outlaws: John Dillinger, Babyface Nelson, Bonnie and Clyde. But where they thrived on chaos and spectacle, Floyd was different. He had a code. He never robbed small-town merchants or took from regular folks. He avoided unnecessary bloodshed. When he could, he gave money to those who helped him hide, making sure their families had food and fuel through the winter. He wasn't pretending to be noble. He simply knew that respect bought loyalty, and loyalty kept him alive. Soon, towns all across Oklahoma and Missouri began treating him like a folk hero. People claimed they'd seen him helping stranded motorists or slipping bills into the hands of widows. Whether those stories were true didn't matter. In a time of hunger and loss, people needed someone to believe in. The law, of course, saw things differently. To them, Pretty Boy Floyd was a menace, a criminal undermining the fragile authority of a nation already falling apart. Bankers wanted him dead. Sheriffs formed posses. Federal agents hunted him across state lines. But for every informant they paid, there were 5 more who warned Floyd first. He was always one step ahead, always just out of reach. There's a story told about a robbery in Kansas City, one that turned his legend into something near mythical. Floyd and his men hit a bank in broad daylight, slipping in and out with precision. But as they fled the scene, a group of townsfolk recognized him. Instead of raising alarm, they cheered. The crowd actually blocked the road when the sheriff tried to pursue. "He's one of ours," they shouted. "He's fighting for the little man." The sheriff could do nothing but curse under his breath as Floyd disappeared into the horizon. It was around this time that Charles met Helen, a woman who saw through the fame and danger and still fell for the man underneath. She wasn't naive, she knew exactly who he was. But there was a charm to him, something raw and magnetic. He treated her with a gentleness that didn't match the world he lived in. For a brief moment, he believed he could have both, a life of love and a life on the run. They'd stay in small motels under false names, living between fear and tenderness. Sometimes they'd drive for hours just to see the sun rise over the hills, pretending they were just another couple chasing freedom. but every time he reached for her hand, he could feel the weight of the gun at his side, a reminder that his peace would never last. The country grew meaner as the years went on. Hunger turned neighbors against each other, and the government, desperate to restore order, began to turn its full power on the outlaws who had become symbols of rebellion. J. Edgar Hoover, the rising force behind the FBI, needed results. He needed trophies. John Dillinger was already being hunted, and the Bureau wanted to make an example of every man who stood in defiance of the system. That's when Pretty Boy Floyd's name landed on the most wanted list. For Floyd, it wasn't fame anymore. It was survival. The heat was everywhere. The same people who once cheered for him now hesitated to open their doors, afraid of the law's retribution. Every knock on the door could be the last. But Floyd wasn't built to surrender. He thrived in the chase. Each new robbery was a test, each escape a middle finger to the men who thought they could cage him. He drove faster, lived harder, and smiled wider, as if daring fate to catch up. There were close calls, plenty of them. Shootouts in cornfields, ambushes on rural roads, blood splattering on dust and asphalt. He was shot once in the shoulder, the pain burning through him like fire. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. He'd patch himself up, grit his teeth, and keep moving. To stop was to die, and to die without fighting was never an option. In those days, the Midwest was alive with the hum of Ford engines and the echo of gunfire. It was the age of the outlaw, and Floyd stood at the center of it all, a man who refused to kneel. The papers made him larger than life, turning every act of defiance into a story of rebellion. The people loved it. They saw him not as a criminal, but as a symbol of justice in a world that had forgotten the meaning of the word. But there were cracks beginning to show. The more famous he became, the more dangerous his world grew. Rivals saw opportunity in his legend, and the law grew bolder with each passing month. His friends started to vanish, some captured, others dead. Every betrayal hit harder, every loss cut deeper. Still, he kept his head high, driving through the night with only the stars to guide him. He'd light a cigarette, glance in the rearview mirror, and say to no one in particular, "They can chase me all they want. They'll never take me alive." It was a dangerous kind of pride, the kind that keeps a man warm in the cold but burns him alive in the end. Floyd didn't just rob banks anymore. He robbed the country of its illusion that order could not be defied. Each heist was a statement. Each escape was a poem written in smoke and gunfire. He was the face of rebellion, whether he wanted to be or not. There was one night, deep in the Ozarks, when he and his crew holed up in a small cabin. The law was closing in. Rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled across the sky, and for the first time, Floyd looked tired. Truly tired. He stared at the window, the lightning reflecting in his eyes, and said softly, "Maybe this is all we get. Maybe we're not meant to grow old." None of the men replied. They just sat there, cleaning their guns, listening to the rain. But dawn came, and with it the fire returned. By the time the posse reached the cabin, they were already gone, leaving behind only tire tracks and cigarette butts. The legend lived on. Pretty Boy Floyd wasn't just a man anymore, he was a movement. To the rich, he was a threat. To the poor, he was hope. And to the law, he was a ghost they could never quite kill. But every legend carries a curse, and Floyd's was already written. He just didn't know how close it was to finding him. For now, though, he rode through the heart of America like a storm, untamed and unbroken. The dust rose behind him, the sky burned orange above, and in that fleeting space between right and wrong, he found something that almost felt like freedom. By 1931, Pretty Boy Floyd was no longer a name whispered in taverns or small-town gossip circles. He was a phenomenon. The banks hated him, the poor adored him, and the law had made him their obsession. Every newspaper in America printed his face on the front page, the handsome young man with slick hair and a half-smile that could charm a room before robbing it blind. But beyond the headlines and the ballads that would later carry his name, the truth was grittier, heavier. Floyd was living a life that moved too fast to hold on to. It was like he'd stepped into a dance with fate, and every step forward brought him closer to the end he couldn't avoid. He'd become a man who couldn't stop moving. The road was his home now, dusty highways, backcountry trails, the endless hum of a Ford V8 engine beneath his feet. His nights were spent in barns, abandoned cabins, and the safe houses of farmers, who'd offer him a bed in exchange for protection or a handful of stolen cash. Some of them didn't even want the money. They just wanted to shake the hand of the man who robbed the rich and burned their debts. He'd sit at their kitchen tables, eat their cornbread, drink their coffee, and listen to their stories. There was something about those moments, the small flickers of normal life, that cut deep into him. He'd smile, laugh even, but behind those blue-gray eyes there was a tiredness he could never shake. He missed his son. That was something the papers never talked about. Charles Floyd had a little boy named Jack Dempsey Floyd back in Oklahoma. He'd send letters sometimes, coded so the law couldn't trace them. He'd send money too, cash wrapped in old newspaper, stuffed in envelopes with no return address. The boy's mother would tell Jack that his father was working far away, that he was a good man just trying to make things right. But deep down, she knew the truth. She knew he'd never come back the same. Prison had taken something from him, and the outlaw life had taken the rest. Still, Floyd clung to the idea that what he was doing had meaning, that every dollar he stole, every mortgage paper he burned, was a small act of vengeance against a system that had crushed men like his father. He didn't think of himself as a killer, though blood had been spilled in his name. He didn't think of himself as evil, even when the newspapers painted him that way. He saw himself as justice in a crooked world, and in a way, maybe he was. The robberies became bolder. One after another, banks from Kansas to Ohio found themselves at the mercy of the man in the gray suit with the charming smile and the Thompson gun. He was careful, meticulous. He never stayed in one place too long, never trusted anyone completely. His reputation brought new faces to his side, eager young men who wanted to ride with the legend. But fame brings rot, and not all who followed him were loyal. Some came for the thrill, others for the money. A few were working for the law without him knowing. By 1932, the FBI, still finding its footing as a national force, had declared war on America's outlaws. Hoover wanted control, order, obedience. He wanted to make an example out of men like Floyd. Every crime committed in the Midwest seemed to bear his name now. Some he'd done, others he hadn't, but it didn't matter. To the government, Pretty Boy Floyd was a symbol, and symbols had to be destroyed. One winter evening, Floyd and two accomplices hit a bank in Sallisaw, Oklahoma. It was a small-town job, clean and quiet, until a patrol car showed up too soon. The air filled with the crack of gunfire, the cold wind carrying the echo down the empty street. When the smoke cleared, two officers lay bleeding. Floyd hadn't wanted blood, but the world didn't give him much choice anymore. From that day forward, the man who'd once been called the gentleman bandit became something else, a hunted animal. He drove through the night, headlights cutting through fog and fear, Helen by his side. She sat silently, watching him from the corner of her eye as he lit another cigarette, his hand steady on the wheel. "You don't have to keep running," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper over the roar of the engine. He didn't answer. What could he say? Running was all he knew now. There were moments of peace, brief and fragile. They'd hide out in the rolling hills of Missouri where the air smelled of pine and the nights were filled with the sound of crickets. He'd sit by a campfire, cleaning his gun with slow, deliberate movements. Helen would hum quietly, a tune he couldn't place but found strangely comforting. For a few hours, he could almost pretend he wasn't the most wanted man in America. But dawn always came, and with it, the sound of distant engines, the whisper of pursuit. Each new robbery brought more money, but less freedom. The law was everywhere. Roadblocks, informants, agents watching every town that might give him shelter. The walls were closing in, but Floyd refused to yield. He was too proud, too angry, too convinced that he was fighting for something larger than himself. When the newspapers accused him of the Kansas City massacre, a brutal shootout that left several officers dead, it was the final straw. Whether he was guilty or not didn't matter. The Bureau had its excuse to end him. That massacre, as it was called, changed everything. The FBI's public image was built on the promise of order and safety. And now they had a villain to hunt. Hoover made sure Floyd's name was splashed across every paper in the country. "Public enemy number one," the headlines screamed. The man who once burned debts was now painted as a bloodthirsty killer. He'd become the face of rebellion, and the nation demanded his head. Floyd's allies began to vanish. One by one, safe houses went dark. Some were raided, others betrayed. He could feel the noose tightening. His once wide network of supporters now lived in fear of federal agents knocking on their doors. The same people who'd cheered him were now silent, praying the storm would pass them by. And through it all, he kept moving. One night in the small town of Bowling Green, he stopped at a roadside diner. He sat alone in a corner booth, hat pulled low, cigarette smoke curling in the air. The waitress poured him coffee, and for a moment, she didn't recognize him. But when she looked closer, her eyes widened. She froze. Floyd met her gaze, his expression calm but heavy with warning. "You didn't see me," he said softly. "You never saw me." She nodded, trembling, and poured more coffee. When he left, she locked the door behind him, tears streaming down her face. She'd seen the face of a legend, and she knew she'd never forget it. That was the thing about Floyd. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was a ghost drifting through the back roads of America, leaving behind stories instead of footprints. Some said he'd been seen in Arkansas, others swore he was in Illinois. The truth was, he was everywhere and nowhere, his legend growing faster than the law could chase it. But no man can outrun his own story forever. By 1933, his luck began to unravel. A robbery went bad outside of Ohio, and one of his partners turned informant. The FBI was waiting before he even arrived. Shots rang out, bullets tearing through the night. Floyd and Helen barely escaped, their car riddled with holes. They drove for hours until the engine finally gave out near the edge of a cornfield. Floyd staggered out, blood seeping through his sleeve, his breath ragged. Helen begged him to stop, to run away somewhere far, to leave this life behind. But he couldn't. The outlaw wasn't just what he did. It was what he had become. They hid in the farmhouse of an old friend, a man named Rhodey. He patched Floyd up, gave him food, and promised to keep his secret. But secrets have a way of leaking, especially when the reward money's high enough. Floyd didn't know it yet, but his circle of trust was collapsing. The Bureau was closing in, led by Melvin Purvis, the same man who'd taken down John Dillinger. And Hoover wanted Floyd's body on display just as much as Dillinger's had been. For now, though, Floyd stayed hidden, his days a blur of restlessness and regret. He'd wake before dawn, staring out at the fog rolling over the fields, his mind heavy with memories of home. He wasn't afraid to die. He'd made peace with that long ago. What haunted him was the thought that maybe none of it had mattered. Maybe all the banks he'd robbed, all the debts he'd burned, had changed nothing. The country was still broken. The poor were still poor. The rich still sat in their offices, untouched and unmoved. But then he'd remember the faces of those he'd helped, the farmers who'd shaken his hand, the widows who'd whispered blessings as he disappeared into the night, and he'd find the strength to keep going. Because even if the world forgot him, he'd know that for a while he made them believe in something. That fall, the leaves began to turn, and with them came a chill Floyd couldn't shake. The days were numbered, though he didn't know how few remained. He drove through small towns where people still spoke his name in hushed admiration, and for a fleeting moment, he could almost pretend he was free again. But every mile brought him closer to the end of the line, closer to East Liverpool, Ohio, where destiny was waiting with a gun and a badge. He drove on, headlights cutting through the October fog, the hum of the engine blending with the beat of his heart. Somewhere in the distance, he thought he saw the outline of a farmhouse, a light glowing faintly in the window. Maybe it was just his mind playing tricks, but for a moment, he imagined it was home. He could almost see his boy running across the field, calling his name, the sound swallowed by the wind. He smiled, though his eyes were heavy. For pretty boy Floyd, the road had always been his ally, his stage, and now, his only friend. The air in October 1934 carried the scent of dying leaves and the weight of something coming to an end. Pretty boy Floyd was moving through Ohio now, drifting from one nameless back road to another, the ghost of the man he'd once been clinging to him like a shadow that refused to leave. His body ached from the endless running. His clothes were worn, his hat frayed, and his eyes carried the kind of tiredness that only comes from being hunted for too long. The money meant nothing anymore. The fame, the stories, the songs people sang in his name, all of it felt distant, like echoes from another life. He wasn't chasing glory now. He was just trying to stay alive a little longer. He'd left Helen behind weeks earlier. It had broken him to do it, but he knew the road ahead was death, and he refused to drag her down with him. The night he said goodbye was cold, the kind of cold that bites through your bones. They sat in the car under a sky full of stars, neither one able to speak. Finally, she reached over, took his hand, and whispered, "You don't have to go down this way, Charlie." He smiled, a small, sad smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I reckon I already have," he said. Then he kissed her forehead, started the engine, and drove off into the darkness without looking back. Now, alone in the driver's seat, he thought about her every night. Her voice, her laugh, the way she'd look at him like there was still a man worth saving underneath all the headlines. He thought about his boy, too, Jack Dempsey Floyd. The image of him had become blurry over time, like an old photograph left in the rain. He wondered if the boy even remembered him, or if his name had become just a curse whispered by adults who wanted to scare children into behaving. He wanted to believe his son would one day understand, that he hadn't been evil, just desperate in a world that left men like him no choice. But the law didn't care for reasons. They wanted results. Melvin Purvis and his bureau men were relentless, driven by orders from Hoover himself. Purvis had already taken down John Dillinger and Babyface Nelson. Now all eyes were on Pretty Boy Floyd, the last of the Great Depression-era bandits still on the run. The newspaper said Purvis was close. Floyd knew it too. Every gas station he passed, every diner he stopped at, he could feel the eyes on him, the tension in the air. Strangers whispered his name under their breath, and he never knew which one might be ready to sell him out for a stack of reward money and a handshake from the FBI. One night, near a small town called Clarkson, Floyd pulled over by an old barn. The engine ticked as it cooled, the silence of the countryside pressing down around him. He stepped out, stretching his stiff legs, the gravel crunching under his boots. He walked a few steps, breathing in the cold night air, trying to quiet the storm in his head. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked, and he froze. His hand went instinctively to the gun at his hip, but it was just a farm dog, probably barking at the wind. He smiled faintly, shaking his head at his own jumpiness. The life of an outlaw had stripped him of peace, left him with reflexes sharper than sense. He found an abandoned shack by the edge of the woods and decided to rest there. Inside, the floor was covered in dust, and the air smelled of old hay and damp wood. He laid his coat down, using it as a pillow, and stared up at the rafters. The sound of the wind whistling through the cracks in the boards reminded him of the Oklahoma plains, of his youth, before everything turned sour. He closed his eyes, and memories flooded back uninvited. The sound of his father's laughter, the sight of his mother hanging laundry under the sun, the way life felt simple once. Back then, the world still seemed fair, or at least survivable. He woke before dawn to the sound of an engine in the distance. His heart thudded in his chest as he reached for his gun. The car drew closer, headlights sweeping over the trees. He crouched by the door, every muscle tense. But then he saw the vehicle, an old pickup truck moving slowly, like it had no reason to hurry. A farmer, maybe. He waited until the sound faded before stepping outside. He couldn't stay there any longer. The road called to him again. By midday, he was hungry, running low on both food and money. He stopped at a small roadside cafe, the kind of place that served black coffee and bacon that tasted more of grease than meat. He sat in the corner, hat pulled low, watching the world move quietly around him. A young waitress brought him a plate, her eyes wide when she saw him. Maybe she recognized him, maybe not, but there was a tension in her smile, the kind that said she'd seen his face somewhere before. "You traveling far?" she asked, trying to sound casual. "A bit," he said, his voice low. "Heading east." When he finished eating, he left a $5 bill on the table, far more than the meal cost. As he stood to leave, she said softly, "You be careful out there, mister." He paused for a second, looked at her and nodded. "Always am." But they both knew that wasn't true. That afternoon, he found himself near East Liverpool, Ohio, a town that sat quietly by the river, surrounded by hills and farmland. the kind of place that seemed peaceful, untouched by the chaos of the world. But under the surface it was buzzing. The FBI had word that Floyd was nearby. Informants had seen a man matching his description hitching rides and hiding out on local farms. Agents swarmed the area, setting up roadblocks, questioning every stranger, every farmer, every passerby. Purvis was certain that this was where it would end. Floyd, unaware of how close the net was, sought shelter at the farm of a man named John Miller. He'd met Miller once before, years ago, when times were better and the law wasn't breathing down his neck. Miller welcomed him in, nervous but loyal. "You can stay the night," he said quietly. "But they're looking for you, Charlie. Word is the whole state's on alert." Floyd nodded, sitting down heavily in a chair. "Ain't the first time they've been looking," he muttered, pulling off his boots. He spent the night in the barn, lying on a bed of hay, his gun close at hand. Sleep came in restless bursts. Every sound, the rustle of the wind, the creak of wood, made his hand twitch toward his weapon. In his dreams he saw his son again, standing in a field, waving. He reached out to him, but the boy faded into mist. He woke drenched in sweat, heart pounding, the early light of morning filtering through the cracks in the boards. That morning, he helped Miller with some chores, trying to look like any other farmhand. He fed the chickens, mended a fence, even shared a laugh when Miller's old dog tripped over a bucket. For a few fleeting hours, it almost felt normal. But normal was a luxury Floyd hadn't had in years. As the day went on, Miller's wife grew nervous. She'd heard talk on the radio. Federal men were combing through the area, questioning farmers. The reward for Floyd was enormous, enough to change a family's fortunes overnight. Floyd could see the fear in her eyes, the silent debate taking place in her heart. He didn't blame her. Fear made people do desperate things. By mid-afternoon, he knew it was time to leave. He shook Miller's hand, thanked him, and started walking along the road that led through the cornfields. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the land. He walked fast, his coat flapping in the wind, his mind racing. Somewhere behind him, an engine started. He turned briefly, saw a car coming down the dirt road, and quickened his pace. Inside that car were federal agents, Purvis among them, and a handful of local officers. They'd gotten a tip, one too specific to ignore. When they spotted the man walking the road, they knew. "That's him," one of the officers said. "That's Pretty Boy Floyd." The car sped up, closing the distance. Floyd heard the roar of the engine and broke into a run, cutting through the field, tall corn stalks whipping against his legs. The agents shouted, "Stop!" Federal agents. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Gunfire erupted, the crack of rifles slicing through the autumn air. Bullets tore through the stalks around him. He stumbled but kept running, firing a few wild shots over his shoulder. The chase lasted only minutes but felt eternal. When he broke through the edge of the field, he found himself in an open clearing, nowhere left to hide. He turned, breathing hard, his gun trembling in his hand. "Drop it, Floyd!" Purvis shouted, stepping forward, revolver raised. For a moment, everything went still. The air, the trees, even time itself. Floyd stood there, chest heaving, eyes wild but proud. Then he said, almost quietly, "You'll have to take me dead." The guns roared again. Floyd staggered back as bullets tore through him, his body jerking with each hit. He fell to his knees, the world spinning around him. He tried to speak but coughed blood instead. Purvis approached slowly, watching as the life drained from the outlaw's eyes. "Is he dead?" one of the agents asked. Purvis looked down at him for a long moment before nodding. "He is now." The legend of Pretty Boy Floyd ended there, in a cornfield under an October sky. They loaded his body into a car, his hat fallen beside him, his face peaceful for the first time in years. When the news broke, it spread across the country like wildfire. Some celebrated. The law had won, the menace was gone. But others mourned. In the small towns of Oklahoma, farmers gathered in silence, their hearts heavy. They didn't see a killer when they looked at Floyd. They saw a man who'd stood up when no one else would, who'd fought a system that had forgotten them. His body was brought back to Oklahoma, where thousands came to see him one last time. They lined the roads, hats in hand, women weeping softly. Some said he looked like he was just sleeping, that even death couldn't erase the calm on his face. A preacher spoke over the casket, but it was the people who carried his memory forward. They told stories of the debts he burned, the banks he robbed, the money he gave to the poor. The papers called him a criminal. The people called him a hero. In the end, Pretty Boy Floyd became more than a man. He became a symbol of rebellion, of resistance, of the human spirit refusing to bow to injustice. His story was sung in ballads, whispered in barrooms, etched into the soul of a generation that had known hunger and hardship. And though the world moved on, his legend never died, because sometimes the line between outlaw and hero isn't drawn by law or morality. It's drawn by who remembers you and why. The sound of the gunfire in that Ohio field did not fade easily. It echoed across the nation, carried by radio broadcasts and newspaper headlines that screamed Public Enemy #1 killed in Ohio. It was the kind of story that sold papers, the kind that made men like J. Edgar Hoover into living legends. The Bureau called it justice. The people who had lost farms and faith during the Great Depression called it tragedy. But to those who had followed Floyd's story, the farmers, the drifters, the ones who saw themselves in him, it was something else entirely. It was the death of a dream, the end of an era where one man with a gun and grit could strike back at a system that had broken millions. When his body was brought back to Oklahoma, the roads filled with cars, wagons, and horse-drawn buggies stretching for miles. It was October 26, 1934, and the sun hung low over the fields, casting a golden light on the crowd that gathered to say goodbye. They came from every corner of the state, men in dusty work shirts, women holding children who had only heard his name in song, old-timers who remembered when the banks had taken everything they owned. They came not to honor a killer, but a man who had given them something rare, hope, even if it came from a gun barrel. Floyd's mother, Mamie, stood near the coffin, her eyes swollen from tears but her back straight as a fence post. "They can call him what they want," she said to a reporter, her voice trembling with both grief and pride. "He was my boy, and he never robbed a poor man." The reporter wrote it down, though his editor would later cut the line from print. The papers preferred cleaner narratives: outlaw killed, justice served, America safe again. But the truth didn't fit neatly in columns or headlines. The truth was that Charles Arthur Floyd had been a product of the same hunger, fear, and anger that had swept across the nation. As the coffin was lowered into the ground at Atkins Cemetery, near the small town of Salisaw, the crowd sang softly. It wasn't hymns they sang, but old folk songs. Songs about hard times and hard men who refused to bow. Some said you could hear the sobs of grown men that day, mixed with the rustle of the wind through the trees. A local fiddler played a slow tune, the kind that carried the weight of 1,000 unsaid words. And when it was over, the people lingered, staring at the mound of fresh earth like it held not just the body of a man, but the last piece of something pure that America had lost. In the weeks that followed, the legend began to take shape. Stories grew like wild grass. Some said he'd once spared a farmer's life because the man's wife was expecting a child. Others claimed Floyd burned mortgage papers during his robberies, freeing dozens of families from crushing debt. Whether any of it was true hardly mattered. The people needed the story more than they needed the facts. They needed to believe that somewhere out there, someone had stood up to the powers that had ground them down. In Washington, Hoover called the operation a triumph. The death of Floyd, he said, was proof that no man could escape the arm of the Bureau. But behind his polished smile and carefully chosen words, there was unease. For all his efforts, Hoover could not control how Floyd was remembered. He could kill the man, but not the myth. Songs began to spread across the country, carried by traveling musicians and radio stations that played the tunes late at night when the airwaves were clear. The most famous of them all came from a young man with a rough voice and a heart full of rebellion, Woody Guthrie. His song, The Ballad of Pretty Boy, Floyd, would immortalize the outlaw in a way the FBI never could. Guthrie sang of the Dust Bowl and the hunger that ate at families like rust eats at iron. He sang of bankers who stole homes and men like Floyd who stole from the banks. "Some will rob you with a 6-gun, the song went, and some with a fountain pen. It was a simple line, but it cut deep. It said what millions were thinking, that the real thieves wore suits, not masks. The song spread like wildfire, turning Floyd from a fugitive into a folk hero, a symbol of the working class fighting back against an uncaring world. Meanwhile, in Salisaw, his widow Helen tried to raise their son in peace. Reporters hounded her, offering money for interviews, digging for dirt, desperate to paint her husband's story in black and white. But she refused to play their game. "You don't know him," she said once, voice steady, eyes hard. "You only know what you've read. He wasn't what you think." She never remarried. Every year on the anniversary of his death, she and her son would visit the grave, laying wildflowers on the cold stone that bore his name. The boy grew up hearing both sides, the lawman's version and the people's version. Somewhere between them lay the truth. In the years after Floyd's death, America changed. The economy slowly recovered. The Dust Bowl faded. New wars loomed on the horizon. But in the quiet corners of the country, the gas stations, the diners, the bars with cracked floors and dusty jukeboxes, his story lived on. Old men would tell it like gospel, their voices low, their eyes distant. He wasn't no saint, they'd say, but he had guts, and he never forgot where he came from. To them, that was enough. The FBI, of course, had its own version of events. They published detailed accounts of his crimes, the robberies, the murders, the escapes. They wanted to strip away the romance, to remind the public that Pretty Boy Floyd was no hero, just another killer. But the more they tried to bury his legend, the deeper it rooted itself in American folklore. Every photograph of his lifeless body only added to the mystery. Every official statement only fueled the rebellion his name inspired. And in a way, Floyd became a mirror for the country itself. Half hero, half sinner, a man torn between justice and survival. The people didn't admire him because he was perfect. They admired him because he was human. Because when the world pushed him down, he pushed back. Years later, when Guthrie sang his ballad on radio shows and in union halls, crowds would listen in silence, eyes fixed on the floor. The song wasn't really about Floyd anymore. It was about all of them. The farmers, the workers, the forgotten. Floyd had become a story they could hold on to when the world felt too cruel to face. His legend was proof that even a poor man could make the powerful tremble, even if only for a moment. As decades passed, the truth became harder to untangle. Historians argued over the details: how many banks he robbed, how many men he killed, whether he truly burned mortgage papers as people claimed. Some said it was myth-making, others swore they'd seen it with their own eyes. But maybe that was the point. Legends aren't built on facts. They're built on what people need to believe. And what people needed, in those hard years, was someone who stood against the machine. By the time the 1950s rolled around, Pretty Boy Floyd's story had already taken on a cinematic glow. Movies, pulp novels, and radio dramas turned him into a larger-than-life figure. In some versions, he was ruthless and cold, a man driven by greed. In others, he was noble and tragic, a rebel who fought for the poor. But in every telling, his name carried the same electricity, a spark of danger, defiance, and dignity. If you walked into a small-town bar in Oklahoma, you might still find his picture hanging behind the counter. The young man with slick hair, sharp eyes, and that half-smile that made him look like he knew something the rest of the world didn't. To those who lived through those desperate years, that picture wasn't just history. It was memory. It was the reminder that sometimes outlaws aren't born from evil. They're born from injustice. Even J. Edgar Hoover, who had built his empire on the capture of men like Floyd, couldn't erase him from the public imagination. The Bureau moved on to other targets: spies, mobsters, communists. But Floyd's name lingered like a ghost, refusing to fade. His grave became a quiet pilgrimage site. Travelers would leave coins, flowers, even whiskey bottles at the headstone. Some said that on still nights, if you stood there long enough, you could hear faint strains of Guthrie's song carried on the wind. Time, as it always does, softened the edges of his story. The blood, the gunfights, the fear, they faded into sepia-colored nostalgia. What remained was the myth, the farm boy who became an outlaw, the outlaw who became a hero, the hero who died unbroken. And maybe that's why his name still stirs something in people, even generations later. Because deep down, everyone has a little of Pretty Boy Floyd in them. That part that refuses to kneel, that still believes one man can fight the world and, for a fleeting moment, win. So when the next outlaw came along, when new names filled the headlines and new crimes shocked the nation, people remembered Floyd and compared them to him. Dillinger was daring but arrogant. Nelson was vicious. But Floyd had heart. He wasn't just running from the law. He was running from a country that had lost its soul. And perhaps that's the real tragedy of Pretty Boy Floyd. He didn't just die in a cornfield. That October afternoon, he died. In a world that no longer had room for men like him, men who lived by their own code and refused to bend. His death marked the end of something, not just the outlaw era, but the last gasp of rebellion in a time when desperation had made saints of sinners. Even now, nearly a century later, his story lingers in the corners of American memory, waiting to be rediscovered by anyone who still believes in the romance of defiance. Because the world will always remember its heroes, and it will always need its outlaws. And in the dust and shadow of history, Pretty Boy Floyd remains both. In the years that followed Floyd's death, America began to change its face. The Great Depression was slowly loosening its grip, but the scars it left behind never really healed. The cities hummed with new industry. The war machine of Europe was beginning to stir, and the people who had once looked at outlaws like Pretty Boy Floyd with a strange mix of fear and admiration now found themselves caught in another kind of struggle. The battle to survive in a country that was learning how to forget. Yet, in the quiet corners of Oklahoma, Missouri, and Kansas, his name still drifted through conversations like smoke. The stories never died. In some places, they grew even louder. Old farmers would tell their grandchildren about the man who burned mortgage papers and gave food to the hungry. Truckers crossing the Midwest would hum Guthrie's song as the miles rolled beneath their wheels. And in bars that smelled of whiskey and dust, men would still raise their glasses to Pretty Boy, swearing they knew someone who once helped him, once shook his hand, once saw him standing proud and smiling, dressed sharp as sin. The line between truth and myth had long since blurred, but that didn't matter. To the people who needed him, the legend of Pretty Boy Floyd had become more real than the man ever was. Helen Floyd tried to build a life in the years after his death. She found work in Tulsa for a while, taking care of her son and keeping her head down. The newspapers wouldn't leave her alone, and neither would the curious. Some came to ask questions out of pity, others out of fascination. A few, more cruel, came to judge. She never gave them what they wanted. She kept her husband's memory close, a wound she refused to let the world prod at. He was a good man, she would tell her boy. He did bad things sometimes, but he never stopped loving you. He just wanted to make things right in a world that wouldn't give him a chance. Jack Dempsey Floyd grew up carrying that name like both a curse and a crown. At school, some kids would whisper behind his back, calling his father a killer. Others would ask what it was like to have a legend for a dad. He didn't know how to answer either question. When he got older, he tried to learn more, reading what he could from newspapers and government files, but nothing matched the man his mother described, the man who smiled at her across a dusty Oklahoma road, the man who danced with her in a roadhouse when they were young, the man who left so she could live free. Somewhere between the stories and the truth, his father existed, unreachable but unforgettable. Meanwhile, J. Edgar Hoover's bureau grew stronger, fatter on the public's trust. The capture and death of Pretty Boy Floyd, along with Dillinger and Nelson, had made Hoover a national hero. He presented himself as the man who had cleaned America of its gangsters, who had turned chaos into order. But beneath that polished image lay a colder truth. Hoover had learned how to use fear. The Bureau was no longer just chasing criminals. It was shaping the story of who was good and who was evil. And in that story, Floyd had become a necessary villain, a symbol of lawlessness that justified Hoover's growing empire of control. Yet not everyone bought that version. Among the working class, especially in the heartland, Floyd's name remained a quiet form of protest. To them, he wasn't a criminal. He was a message, a reminder that when the system fails the people, someone will always rise up, even if it costs him his soul. It wasn't about the robberies or the killings anymore. It was about defiance, about standing tall when the world tells you to bow. Every year, on the anniversary of his death, small gatherings would form at his gravesite. Farmers, drifters, and dreamers would come to pay their respects. Some left flowers, others left coins or small notes scrawled with thanks. Once, in the late 1940s, an old man drove all the way from Kansas just to kneel by the stone and whisper, "You were right to fight, son. They still don't care about us." The caretaker said he cried for a long time, then left without saying another word. By the 1950s, America had new heroes and new villains. The outlaws of the past had become romanticized figures, their crimes softened by time and nostalgia. Hollywood discovered them, turning their lives into movies filled with handsome actors, fast cars, and glamorous shootouts. Pretty Boy Floyd was portrayed as everything from a cold-blooded killer to a misunderstood anti-hero. One film showed him walking into a bank and tearing up mortgage papers, smiling at terrified tellers before disappearing into the sunset. It was a beautiful lie, but a lie people wanted to believe. In the glow of the movie screen, the truth became irrelevant. What mattered was how he made people feel, that flicker of rebellion in a world too eager to conform. Woody Guthrie kept singing his song until his dying days, passing it down to younger voices who carried it into the next generation. When the folk revival of the 1960s began, the story of Pretty Boy Floyd was reborn once more. Singers like Bob Dylan picked up the tune, turning it into an anthem for a new kind of rebellion. The audience might not have known the full story. They didn't need to. What mattered was the idea behind it. The man who robbed banks in the name of justice had become a symbol again, this time for those fighting against political corruption, racial inequality, and war. Somewhere in the hills of Oklahoma, Helen Floyd grew old. Her hair turned silver, her voice soft. She rarely spoke publicly anymore, but those who knew her said she never stopped believing that her husband had been wronged, not by fate, but by the world that refused to see the man behind the headlines. When she passed away, she was buried near him, her headstone simple, her legacy forever tied to his. On quiet nights, locals say you can hear the wind sigh through the grass at Aiken Cemetery, carrying with it the faint hum of an old folk tune. In the 1970s and 80s, historians tried to piece together the truth. FBI records were unsealed, old witnesses interviewed, new documentaries made. What emerged was complicated. Floyd had indeed robbed banks. People had died during his crimes. But the myth of him as a heartless killer didn't hold up. Most of his violence had been against those who stood in his way, never against ordinary folk. And though it was never proven that he burned mortgage papers, enough people swore they saw it that it became its own kind of truth, the kind that facts can't touch. To this day, criminologists and writers still debate his place in history. Was he a Robin Hood or a reckless gunman? A victim of circumstance or a man who chose his path? The answer shifts depending on who you ask. But maybe that's the beauty of his story. It refuses to be simple. He wasn't one thing or the other. He was both. He was all of it. The truth is that Pretty Boy Floyd's life reads like a mirror of America itself. A country born from rebellion, built on defiance, forever torn between justice and power. His story reminds us that heroes and villains often wear the same face, and that the line between them is drawn not by the acts they commit, but by who tells the story afterward. In Oklahoma, there's still a mural in Sallisaw that shows him standing tall, hat tilted, eyes bright, with a Thompson gun slung across his chest. Tourists take pictures there, not because they know every detail of his life, but because they can feel what he represents. The mural isn't about a man. It's about an idea. The idea that in the darkest of times, even when the world crushes you, you can still choose to stand and fight. If you drive down the back roads of the Midwest today, you might still find whispers of him. A diner waitress who says her grandmother once fed him. An old-timer who swears his father rode with him. A local musician playing a slow tune on his guitar, singing about a man who robbed from the rich and gave to the poor. The truth doesn't matter anymore. What matters is the feeling his name stirs, that electric pulse of defiance that still runs through the veins of a country built on rebellion. In the end, Floyd's legacy wasn't written by Hoover or the FBI or even by the newspapers that tried to define him. It was written by the people, the ones who needed to believe that sometimes the law could be wrong and justice could live in the hands of a man outside it. His story became a language of resistance, a reminder that power doesn't always wear a badge, and righteousness doesn't always come from a courtroom. He died young, but the myth never aged. Each generation found something new in him, a lesson, a warning, a spark. Some saw the tragedy of wasted potential. Others saw the glory of defiance. but all saw the man who refused to crawl, even when the whole world was trying to break him. And maybe that's why Pretty Boy Floyd will always belong to history's gray spaces, the places where saints and sinners meet. Because in that uneasy balance between right and wrong, between rebellion and ruin, he found his immortality. His story isn't just about guns or robberies or FBI agents chasing shadows through cornfields. It's about a man who looked at the injustice of his time and said, "No more." That's the story America keeps telling, again and again. The story of those who dared to fight even when the world called them criminals. Pretty Boy Floyd's heart stopped beating long ago, but his spirit still runs wild through the stories that bear his name, whispering through the dust of forgotten roads, waiting for someone to listen. Time has a strange way of reshaping the past. Decades after Pretty Boy Floyd's death, the world moved on, but the myth refused to fade. It drifted through the veins of America like a ghost, whispered in truck stops, sung in roadside bars, printed on postcards and dusty history books. For every lawman who called him a cold-blooded killer, there were 10 who swore he was a hero of the poor. The truth lived somewhere between those versions, twisting and turning with each retelling, until the man himself became something else, not flesh and bone, but legend. In the 1950s, when television began to dominate American homes, Floyd's name found new life on the screen. The stories grew more polished, the violence more glamorous. He was played by actors who spoke smooth lines and died in slow motion under perfect lighting. For those who had lived through the Great Depression, who had lost farms, homes, and families, these retellings carried a strange comfort. Watching a man fight back, even if he died doing it, felt like reclaiming something they had lost long ago. The faces on the screens weren't just outlaws. They were symbols of defiance, living proof that ordinary people could shake the foundations of power, even for a moment. But Hollywood's gloss came at a cost. The real man vanished beneath the script. Gone was the dirt of Oklahoma, the smell of sweat and fear in the getaway cars, the cold nights spent hiding in barns with the wind slicing through broken boards. Gone was the human weight of his choices, the guilt, the exhaustion, the fleeting moments of kindness that no one saw. In their place came a cleaner, safer version of rebellion, the kind America could cheer for without ever questioning what drove it. By the time the 1960s rolled in, Floyd had become part of the country's folklore. His story lived alongside Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Bonnie and Clyde, each outlaw a reflection of their era's discontent. Protesters marched in the streets, music filled the air, and distrust in authority ran high. In coffee houses and smoky bars, folk singers strummed their guitars and sang about Floyd as if he were one of them, a man who had stood against corruption when the system had turned its back on the people. To them, he wasn't a criminal. He was a symbol of rebellion against injustice, a voice that refused to be silenced. Woody Guthrie's song, The Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd, had by then become an anthem. It traveled across generations, carried by voices that understood what it meant to be forgotten, overlooked, or crushed by the weight of society's rules. Each verse painted Floyd not as a monster, but as a man caught in the gears of a machine too big to fight. Guthrie's words, "Some will rob you with a 6-gun and some with a fountain pen," hit harder than any bullet. They reminded listeners that crime didn't always wear a mask. Sometimes it wore a suit. Meanwhile, deep in Oklahoma, the people who had known Floyd still kept his memory alive in quieter ways. They told stories not to glorify him, but to remember him as he was. A man who laughed loud, cursed often, and loved fiercely. A man who made mistakes but never ran from the consequences. They said he had a soft spot for children, that he'd stop his car to toss a coin or a candy to a kid on the roadside. They said he never took more than he needed, and never harmed those who couldn't defend themselves. Maybe those memories were romanticized over time, but to the people who shared them, they were more than stories. They were a way of keeping his spirit alive in a world that had long since forgotten compassion. Law enforcement, however, remembered him differently. To the FBI, Floyd remained one of the early symbols of organized resistance against federal authority. His death had been used as a warning, a reminder that the government could and would bring down anyone who dared to defy it. Hoover himself made sure of that. The Bureau's files on Floyd remained classified for years, thick with reports, telegrams, and testimonies that painted him as a danger to society. But behind those cold words lay an unspoken truth. Floyd's legend had embarrassed them. Despite all their power, all their guns, and all their manhunts, they had needed to destroy his reputation as much as they needed to kill him. When historians later reviewed those records, the cracks began to show. The official version of his death, that he was armed, resisting arrest, didn't line up with eyewitness accounts. Local farmers swore he was unarmed, shot down while trying to surrender. Others said he had been executed in cold blood, his body left as a warning to anyone who might follow in his footsteps. The truth was buried somewhere under the dust of history, and by the time anyone tried to find it, the people who had seen it with their own eyes were long gone. What remained was the myth, cleaner, simpler, more convenient, but myths have power. They outlive the men who create them. And Floyd's myth, born out of pain and defiance, grew into something far greater than the man himself. It became a language for the forgotten. During the civil rights era, his story was invoked by activists who saw in him a kindred spirit, someone who refused to bow to unjust authority. In the 1970s, as corporate greed began to rise again, the story took on new meaning. "Some will rob you with a six-gun." Guthrie's words echoed in the minds of those who watched their wages shrink while the rich grew richer. Floyd's ghost lingered in those lyrics, nodding silently in agreement. The more time passed, the more his story shifted. Each generation reshaped it to fit its own struggles. By the 1980s, America was obsessed with power, wealth, and image. The gangster had become a pop culture icon, ruthless, stylish, untouchable. Pretty Boy Floyd was no longer the dusty outlaw of Oklahoma. He was a brand, a symbol of rebellion wrapped in glamour. Movies and TV shows cast him as a charming anti-hero, his grit replaced by swagger. He had become entertainment, but not everyone bought the Hollywood version. There were still those who looked deeper, historians, writers, and musicians who felt something sacred in his story. They traveled to Salisaw, to the old roads where he once drove, trying to trace the footsteps of a man who had vanished into history. They spoke to locals, combed through archives, pieced together letters and police reports. What they found wasn't a saint, but neither was it a villain. It was a man, complex, flawed, passionate, human. One writer described visiting Floyd's grave one rainy afternoon. The cemetery was empty, the sky a dull gray. She said she felt an odd stillness, as if the air itself was holding its breath. When she stood before the simple headstone, she noticed something unexpected. Fresh flowers. No one knew who left them, but they were always there. Every year, someone somewhere still cared. The writer said that moment made her realize that legends don't survive because they're perfect. They survive because they speak to something eternal. Pretty Boy Floyd, in his defiance, spoke to the part of the human soul that refuses to surrender. Even now, his story remains relevant. In a world where inequality still festers, where power often crushes the powerless, Floyd's ghost feels familiar. He is the whisper that reminds us that justice isn't always written by those in charge. His story carries a question, one that has never been answered. When the law serves the rich, what choice does the poor man have? The answer depends on who you ask. To some, he'll always be a criminal, a man who took what wasn't his and paid the price. To others, he'll remain a folk hero, a man who fought back when the system gave him no other option. The truth may lie somewhere in between, but one thing is certain. His story endures because it's not just about him. It's about us, about what we become when the world leaves us with nothing but our anger and our pride. In recent years, new documentaries and podcasts have revisited his tale, peeling back the myth to expose the man underneath. Listeners hear about his childhood poverty, his charm, his desperation, his mistakes. They hear about his final moments, the gunfire, the betrayal. But when the final episode fades, when the credits roll and the voices fall silent, something lingers, a sense of injustice that time cannot erase. The story of Pretty Boy Floyd is not a clean one. It's raw, imperfect, and painfully human, and that's why it matters. Somewhere out there, on a forgotten back road under a vast Oklahoma sky, you can still feel him, not as a ghost haunting the land, but as a presence that refuses to be buried. The wind carries his name through the fields, whispering it like a secret. In the distance, a train rattles by, its whistle cutting through the air like a memory. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear the echo of a man laughing, the low rumble of an engine starting, the promise of one last getaway. Pretty boy Floyd may have died with bullets in his chest, but the man they killed that October day was only flesh. The legend, the idea of him, never died. It lives on in every story told by firelight, in every song sung about injustice, in every heart that still dares to defy. His story is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous thing a man can do is refuse to kneel. And as long as there are those willing to stand up against the odds, to fight for a little bit of fairness in an unfair world, Pretty boy Floyd will never truly be gone. He'll live on in every act of rebellion, every quiet refusal, every whisper of no more. Because the outlaw who defied America wasn't just one man. He was a reflection of everyone who ever looked at the system and said, "This isn't right." As the years slipped further away from the dust and gunfire of the 1930s, the myth of Pretty Boy Floyd took on a life of its own. He had become a ghost in America's bloodstream, showing up in places where you least expected him, on the lips of old men telling stories that started with, "I knew a fella who knew him," in the quiet twang of a country song, in the yellowed pages of history books that tried to make sense of a man who never quite fit the mold. The outlaw had long since turned to earth, but his name still carried a strange kind of electricity. You could feel it in the way people said it, with a mix of pride, awe, and sorrow, as if speaking about something sacred that shouldn't be forgotten. By the 1990s, America had changed almost beyond recognition. The dusty roads Floyd once sped down in a stolen Ford were now paved highways buzzing with 18-wheelers. The Depression-era shacks that had shaped him were long gone, replaced by strip malls and chain restaurants. But in Sallisaw, Oklahoma, the place where it all began, his shadow remained. The town had grown quiet, but if you stood in the right spot, at the right time, you could still feel it. The air seemed heavier there, as if the land itself remembered the chase, the fear, the hope. Old-timers still gathered at local diners and gas stations, swapping stories about the outlaw who became a legend. Some claimed he was buried with money still hidden somewhere in the Oklahoma hills. Others swore that a cousin of theirs had once seen him alive after the papers said he was dead. There was even a rumor that he'd faked his death, escaped under another name, and lived out his years in Mexico. Everyone knew it wasn't true, but people told the story anyway because it felt better than the truth, that a man like Floyd, who had fought so hard against the odds, could end up broken and bleeding in a field. Myths are born when reality feels too cruel to believe. The younger generation didn't always know the full story, but they knew the name. They heard it in songs, saw it in old movies, sometimes even in video games or documentaries that tried to capture the gangster era. For them, Floyd wasn't a man of flesh and struggle. He was a symbol, a kind of outlaw romanticism that spoke to something deeper, the part of every human heart that resents being told what to do, that yearns to be free even if it means breaking the rules. It was the same instinct that had driven him once, when he was just a poor boy trying to survive in a world that seemed determined to crush him. In time, the story of Pretty Boy Floyd became more than just a historical account. It became an American parable. Professors discussed him in university courses about folklore and justice. Writers compared him to Robin Hood, Billy the Kid, even ancient rebels like Spartacus. Each retelling revealed as much about the storyteller as it did about Floyd himself. Some emphasized his charm, his kindness, the way he supposedly handed out money to struggling farmers. Others fixated on his crimes, the blood he spilled, the banks he robbed. But no matter the angle, the story always ended the same way, with the sound of gunfire and a man dying on the ground, surrounded by enemies. That image, tragic and defiant, became the heart of his myth, and yet, beneath all the legend, there were still traces of the man who had once been Charles Arthur Floyd. Letters from family, fragments of interviews with those who had known him, even old photographs that showed a young man with sharp features and a grin that could melt through trouble. Those who looked closely enough could see the complexity in his eyes, a mix of ambition, anger, and a strange tenderness that didn't belong to the monster the newspapers had made him out to be. In one rare photo, taken before his name became infamous, Floyd stands beside a car, his hat tilted, his suit neatly pressed. He looks proud but not arrogant, confident but not cruel. There's something haunting about that image, as if he's standing at the edge of fate, unaware of how close he is to becoming a legend. You can almost see the weight of his choices forming in the background, the desperation, the roads that would soon carry him into history. As historians dug deeper into his story, they found contradictions that couldn't be ignored. Bank records and police files painted him as a dangerous man, but the people he grew up with remembered something different. They told stories of how he helped neighbors fix fences, bought groceries for hungry families, and once rescued a child from drowning in a creek. To them, Floyd wasn't an outlaw. He was one of their own, pushed too far by a world that had no mercy for the poor. Maybe both versions were true. Maybe that was the point. In America, heroes and villains often come from the same place. It all depends on who's holding the pen, and for most of his life, the pen was in the hands of those who feared him. The bankers, the lawmen, the men in suits who saw him as a threat to their power. They needed him to be a villain so they could feel like heroes. But time has a way of turning those stories inside out. The farther you move from the gunfire, the clearer the echoes sound. By the 2000s, Floyd's story was once again being rediscovered, not as a tale of crime, but as a reflection of America itself. Documentaries portrayed him as a man caught in a brutal system, someone who fought back in the only way he knew how. Authors and filmmakers began to question the official narrative. Why had the FBI been so determined to destroy him, even after he was no longer a threat? Why had they made sure to paint him as a monster even in death? The more people asked, the less certain the answers became. Some began to see him as an early victim of propaganda, a man used as a pawn in Hoover's quest to legitimize his bureau. Floyd's death, they argued, had been less about justice and more about spectacle. A public execution meant to send a message. It wasn't just about one outlaw. It was about control. By turning men like Floyd into symbols of evil, the government could rally a desperate nation around law and order, even if that law had little mercy to offer. And so the myth turned again, this time not as a story of rebellion, but as a warning. The question it left behind was simple but chilling. When does justice become vengeance? Floyd's life didn't offer an easy answer, but it forced people to look deeper at the world around them, to see the cracks in the system, the hypocrisy in the stories told by those in power. Even now, nearly a century later, the echoes of that question still linger. The world may have new kinds of criminals, new faces on the news, new wars, and new systems of control, but the heart of Floyd's story remains timeless. It's about a man who refused to be crushed by the weight of his circumstances. It's about defiance, pride, and the human hunger for dignity, even when the world calls it crime. Each year, a small group of visitors still makes its way to his grave. They come from all over, Oklahoma, Missouri, Kansas, even farther. Some bring flowers, others small trinkets, and some just stand in silence, staring at the name carved into the stone. Charles Arthur Floyd, 1904-1934. The dates feel impossibly small for a life so large. Wind brushes across the grass, and for a moment, it almost feels like the world is holding its breath. It's said that when you stand there at dusk, you can hear the faint hum of a car engine somewhere far off, even when no cars are around. Locals swear it's him, still riding the back roads of Oklahoma, still running from the law that never really caught his soul. Maybe it's superstition, or maybe it's something else. Some stories don't die because they're too true to be forgotten. The legend of Pretty Boy Floyd has become more than a gangster tale. It's a story about the contradictions at the heart of America, the dream and the struggle, the promise and the punishment. It reminds us that even in a land built on freedom, some people have to steal it just to taste it, and for that reason his name still carries weight. It's not about the banks or the bullets anymore. It's about what he represented, a man who refused to bow. If you listen to the right kind of music, if you read the right kind of story, if you drive down a long, empty highway with the radio low and the wind in your face, you'll understand why his name still matters. Because Pretty Boy Floyd wasn't just a man who defied America. He was America, its beauty, its rage, its hunger, its contradictions. He was the side of the country that doesn't get written into the history books but beats in the heart of every person who's ever looked at power and said, "You can't take everything from me." And maybe that's why he still haunts the world. Not as a warning or a ghost of violence, but as a whisper. A reminder that even in defeat, defiance has its own kind of victory. There's a kind of silence that falls over places where history has spilled blood, a silence not born from peace, but from remembrance. The hills of Ohio and the plains of Oklahoma carry that kind of stillness, the kind that hums beneath the soil, whispering the names of men who died trying to outrun their fates. Among those whispers, one name always rises above the rest: cutting through time like the crack of a rifle in the distance. Pretty boy Floyd. His story, no longer bound by the newspapers that damned him or the songs that sanctified him, lives in that silence. It breathes through the dust, through the wind that rolls across the land he once called home. As the new century moved forward, America began to look back with fresh eyes. The history of its outlaws, once painted in black and white, was now seen in shades of gray. The lines between right and wrong had always been blurred in Floyd's story, but now people were beginning to see just how deeply that gray bled into everything. Writers, historians, and filmmakers returned to his tale with questions that previous generations never dared to ask. What does it mean to be an outlaw in a world that leaves you no other choice? And what happens to a man when his name becomes a weapon used by both sides, the law and the people? Documentaries began popping up again. New books re-examined the FBI files, and investigative journalists dug through archives that had been sealed for decades. What they found wasn't a maniac or a martyr, but something far more human, a man caught between desperation and destiny. The story that emerged wasn't clean. It never could be. Floyd's life had been a storm of contradictions, compassion and violence, loyalty and betrayal, faith and fury. He wasn't a saint. He wasn't a monster. He was something far more unsettling, a man who saw injustice and refused to accept it, even when it destroyed him. The scholars traced his path, trying to map the moments where the man ended and the myth began. They found that the earliest newspapers twisted his image before he even had a chance to speak for himself. Each robbery, each rumor, each gunfight added another layer to the legend until the real Floyd was buried under his own name. One article from 1931 described him as a devil in silk, another as a folk hero with a machine gun. Those who had actually met him told a different story, of a man who loved to dance, who sang along to the radio, who had a soft voice and tired eyes. The truth was, Floyd never wanted to be famous. Fame was for men who lived long enough to enjoy it. What he wanted was dignity, a life where he didn't have to beg for what was rightfully his. But dignity is a dangerous thing to chase when the whole world is rigged against you. The more he fought for it, the more the world called him an outlaw. That's the curse of men like him. They're remembered for their rebellion, not their reasons. The new interpretations of his story painted him as a man symbolic of the American struggle itself, the dream of fairness, the betrayal of that dream, the fight to reclaim it. Historians began calling him a social bandit, a term once used for figures like Robin Hood, men who committed crimes not out of greed but out of a sense of justice twisted by circumstance. The people he robbed from were not the poor, not the hungry, but the institutions that had already stolen from them. The banks, the system, the faceless machine. It was this version of Floyd that resonated deeply with modern audiences. In an age where greed wore corporate suits and power hid behind polished smiles, the image of a man who stood up against it, even at the cost of everything, struck a familiar chord. People began to see themselves in his defiance. The same hunger, the same rage, the same exhaustion from a world that kept taking and never giving back. In Oklahoma, tourism around his story picked up again. There were tours of the places where he was said to have lived, museums with exhibits displaying his photographs, his letters, even the gun said to have been found near his body. But the strangest thing was that these places didn't feel like tributes to a criminal. They felt like memorials. Visitors didn't come to glorify his crimes. They came to understand his fight, to feel closer to the man who, for a brief, furious moment, made the world listen to the forgotten. At the same time, others still clung to the darker version. Law enforcement groups and crime historians reminded the world that he had been part of a violent wave, that people had died because of his choices. They warned against romanticizing men who used violence to make a point. They weren't wrong. But what they often missed was that for men like Floyd, violence wasn't the goal. It was the language the world forced upon them. When you grow up in silence, sometimes the only way to be heard is to make noise loud enough to shake the walls. A writer once described Floyd's life as a poem written in gunpowder and grief. It's a fitting image. He was a man whose every act, every breath, was a verse in that tragic song. The words changed depending on who sang them. A rebel, a thief, a husband, a father. Each label was true and each one was incomplete. His story wasn't about right or wrong. It was about survival, and the cost of daring to claim what life refused to offer. In 2010, a filmmaker set out to create what he called the most honest version of Pretty Boy Floyd's story ever told. He spent years interviewing historians, reading FBI files, traveling the roads Floyd once drove. The movie that came out wasn't a gangster film in the traditional sense. There were no glamorous heists or roaring Tommy guns. Instead, it showed a man slowly consumed by the world's cruelty. A man whose kindness was eroded by betrayal, whose hope was ground down by desperation. The final scene showed him walking alone through a field, the sound of distant sirens closing in. He looks up at the sky, and for a fleeting second, he smiles, not in triumph, but in peace. When the gunfire comes, it feels inevitable, like the last line of a story that's been writing itself all along. Audiences wept. Critics called it one of the most haunting portraits of an outlaw ever made. For the first time, the story wasn't about the chase or the crime. It was about the man inside the myth. And when the credits rolled, there was a long, aching silence, the kind that only follows truth. Today, when people talk about Pretty Boy Floyd, they no longer talk just about what he did. They talk about why he did it. The context that was once stripped away from him has been restored piece by piece by those who refuse to let his humanity vanish beneath history's weight. He's no longer just a chapter in America's gangster era. He's a mirror, reflecting everything this country wants to believe about itself and everything it tries to forget. Because in the end, Floyd's story isn't about banks or bullets or the FBI. It's about what happens when a man's sense of justice collides with the cold machinery of power. It's about a boy who looked at the world and saw no place for himself, so he decided to carve one out, even if it meant being branded an enemy. It's about how legends are made, not by perfection, but by resistance, by the refusal to kneel. As night falls over Salisaw, the wind hums through the trees, and crickets sing in the tall grass around his grave. The stars hang heavy over the plains, the same stars he once looked up at when he was a boy, dreaming of more than what life had handed him. Somewhere out there, the hum of the highway echoes faintly, like a ghostly engine idling in the distance. Maybe it's imagination, or maybe it's something else. A reminder that some spirits don't rest because their story isn't done being told. Pretty Boy Floyd's story is a wound America keeps reopening, not out of pain, but out of necessity. Each generation rediscovers him because each generation needs him. Not as a hero, not as a villain, but as a reminder that freedom has always been a fight, and that the line between justice and law is thinner than we want to believe. He once said, "I've been hunted down like a dog, but I never hurt nobody that didn't have it coming." Whether that's truth or denial, only he knew. But in those words lies the heartbeat of his legend, the sense that beneath the blood and chaos, there was a code, a kind of moral rebellion that refused to die quietly. And perhaps that's why the world can't let go of him. Because deep down, we all know there's a part of Floyd in each of us. The part that wants to stand up when the world pushes too hard, that wants to fight back even when it's hopeless, that wants to leave behind more than just a name. And so the story continues. Not just in books or songs or films, but in the quiet moments when someone somewhere decides they've had enough. That's when the ghost of Pretty Boy Floyd rises again, not in gunfire, but in defiance. They say every outlaw's story ends the same way, not in glory, not in fire, but in silence. Time has a way of erasing the noise, sanding down the edges of violence and rebellion until what's left are only echoes and questions. Pretty Boy Floyd's story has lived longer than his body ever did. It's carried through the decades by the ones who can't quite let go of him. Historians, musicians, old-timers who still talk about the man with the soft voice and the hard eyes. The one who smiled like he knew something the rest of the world didn't. In the end, his legacy became something no bullet could kill, a symbol. But symbols are strange things. They twist and evolve with every generation that inherits them, becoming mirrors that reflect more about the people remembering than the man himself. In the early years after his death, the newspapers continued their war on his ghost. The headlines were cruel and absolute. Public enemy number one destroyed. Justice served. Outlaw era ends. The Bureau of Investigation took credit for restoring order to a terrified nation. They paraded photos of his lifeless body like trophies, making sure the public understood that this was the fate of all who dared to challenge authority. But even then, there was a strange dissonance in the way people responded. For every cheer in the cities, there was a sigh of sorrow in the countryside. Farmers in Oklahoma and Arkansas read those papers and shook their heads. To them, Floyd wasn't a menace. He was a man who struck back at a system that had already broken them. They whispered his name like a prayer and a warning, both at once. Years passed, and the country changed. The Great Depression gave way to war, and then to an age of prosperity built on the bones of those hard times. But Floyd's story lingered, tucked away in the corners of American memory. In 1939, a song began to travel across the airwaves. The Ballad of Pretty Boy Floyd, written and sung by Woody Guthrie. It was a simple tune, a folk song with the heart of rebellion beating underneath its melody. In it, Guthrie painted Floyd not as a villain, but as a man of the people. "Some will rob you with a six-gun, and some with a fountain pen," he sang, drawing a line between the outlaw hunted by the law and the bankers who destroyed lives from behind polished desks. That song changed everything. It gave Floyd back his soul. Suddenly, the myth wasn't just about a man running from the law. It was about what he represented. The fight against greed, the anger of the forgotten, the spirit of those who refused to bow. Folk singers carried his story across America's highways and small towns, from dusty bars to union rallies. He became an anthem for the working class, a ghost who rode alongside them in every struggle, every protest, every moment when justice felt too far away. By the time the 1950s rolled in, Floyd's image had been reimagined by Hollywood. He was cast as the charming outlaw, good-looking, fearless, tragic. Actors with slicked-back hair and sharp suits played him on screen, turning his grit into glamour. The studios romanticized his robberies, turned his death into slow-motion poetry. Audiences ate it up, drawn to the contradiction of a man both righteous and ruthless. But beneath the lights and celluloid, something essential was lost. The real Floyd, the dirt under his nails, the hunger in his belly, the fear behind his defiance, was buried under Hollywood gold. It wasn't until decades later that historians began peeling back those layers. They found testimonies from townspeople, old lawmen, and relatives who remembered the truth. A man who had moments of kindness that didn't fit the script. He gave food to starving families. He left money for widows whose farms were taken by the bank. He was, in many ways, a contradiction the country didn't know how to process. Too good to be a monster, too dangerous to be a saint. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. Floyd had killed. There was no denying that. There were robberies that went wrong, blood spilled, and lives lost. But even those who hunted him admitted there was something different about him. A strange moral compass, warped but not broken. One agent wrote in his report that Floyd carried himself like a soldier, not a thug. Another described him as a man who believed he was right, and that made him dangerous. That was the paradox at the heart of his legend. A criminal with a conscience, a rebel with a cause he couldn't fully name. As the years went on, the memory of Floyd evolved again. In the 1960s and 70s, when America faced its own reckoning with power, corruption, and rebellion, his story resurfaced as a kind of prophecy. Young people saw in him a reflection of their own anger, against the system, against hypocrisy, against a world that chewed up the poor and crowned the corrupt. His name appeared in songs again, in novels and political speeches. He was invoked not as a criminal, but as a cautionary tale. What happens when the system leaves no room for mercy? In the town of Salisaw, where he was born, they began holding small gatherings every October. Locals would come together, share stories, play Guthrie's song, and talk about the man who had once walked those same roads. Over time, those gatherings grew into something like a festival. Historians, tourists, and curious travelers would arrive, walking through fields and abandoned homesteads, trying to feel the ghost of an era long gone. There was something deeply human in those moments, the way people searched for connection through a man they'd never met. But not everyone agreed on how he should be remembered. Some argued that Floyd's legend glorified lawlessness, that it encouraged rebellion instead of respect for justice. Others countered that justice without empathy wasn't justice at all. The debates grew louder as the years passed. But the one thing no one could deny was that Floyd's story had survived. It had transcended the decades, adapted to every new world that rose from the ashes of the old one. He had become timeless. In the archives of the FBI, his file still sits, thick with reports, clippings, and photographs. On the front cover, the label reads, Charles Arthur Floyd, deceased, October 22, 1934. Inside, the story unfolds in black ink and cold typewriter keys. Aliases, sightings, statements, autopsy details. But what those pages cannot contain is the pulse that still beats beneath his name. The pages tell of a man killed in a cornfield, but they cannot capture the thousands who mourned him, or the way his myth took root and refused to die. If you drive through Oklahoma today, you can still find pieces of him. A marker where his body was found, a museum display with his photographs, a diner where old men talk about Charlie Floyd like he was family. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you'll hear the faint echo of that Guthrie song drifting through a jukebox or over a radio. It always hits the same way, bittersweet, nostalgic, raw. The story isn't over because legends don't end. They just change form. In a way, Floyd got what he wanted, not the freedom he fought for in life, but something quieter. Immortality through memory. The law buried him in the ground, but the people resurrected him in story. And maybe that's the truest kind of justice there is. To live on in the hearts of those who understood, even when the world didn't. It's strange to think that a man who spent his life running could one day stand still in the pages of history. But that's the power of myth. It stops time. Somewhere out there, in the minds of those who still believe in him, Pretty Boy Floyd is forever young, forever defiant, forever driving down a lonely road with dust in his wake and a gun on the seat beside him, the radio humming low. He's not running from the law anymore. He's running from being forgotten. And maybe that's how all legends survive, by becoming something bigger than their sins. By turning their pain into poetry, their rebellion into a story that outlives every bullet, every betrayal, every lie. Pretty Boy Floyd wasn't a saint. He wasn't a hero. But he was something America needed. A reminder that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who see too clearly how the world works. And in a time when justice was sold to the highest bidder, he chose to take it back by force. His story ends where it began, in the dust, in the struggle, in the heart of a man who refused to kneel. The rest is silence, filled only by the echo of his name. If you've listened this far, remember this. Stories like Floyd's aren't just about the past. They're about the present, about every person who's ever looked at the world and felt like it was rigged against them. About every fight for fairness that never makes the headlines. About the cost of standing up when the world wants you to stay down. So if this story moved you, if you felt that fire flicker for even a moment, don't let it die. Share it, keep it alive, because history only remembers the ones we refuse to forget. And that's what Pretty Boy Floyd deserves. Not forgiveness, not condemnation, but remembrance. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history, where truth and legend walk hand in hand, and the ghosts of the past still whisper through the wind.